All right, welcome everybody. It is my pleasure to give an introduction to John Filla, who had actually gave us the keynote last year, the Big Blue Button World. John, I'll share with you his bio. John is an award-winning educator, speaker, and author. John has led digital accessibility initiatives, developed curriculum, and facilitated the adoption and update of open educational resources. He has written books on the use of AI in education. John also serves as an educational consultant, providing presentations and workshops for school districts and organizations. John was a 2022 Minnesota Teacher of the Year finalist. I am not surprised. He also offers workshops and trainings for organizations through inclusiveaistrategies.com. I'll put a link in the chat here. John, again, it's a pleasure to have you back. God, there's so much happened in AI in the last year. So please, you have the floor. Take it away.
Thank you, Fred. I appreciate you having me back. So I'll be sharing a lot of information very quickly, and I just want to make sure that I can cover as much as I can in the limited time that we have. And if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat, raise your hand, and I'll make sure that there's time at the end that we can have a conversation. And because there is a break at the end of this session, I'm happy to stay on and continue the conversation and answer questions. So like Fred said, my name is John Fila. I'm currently in Chicago, and I've been an educator for 26 years now, and I come at this through lots of different perspectives as a teacher, as a curriculum writer, as someone who supports administrators, different digital accessibility initiatives. And so there's a wide range of experience that I have in dealing with these tools. And while things kind of appear to be changing so quickly, you may be familiar with the phrase, the more things change, the more they stay the same. It's my view that there has been no technology that has come about that by default was meant to support marginalized populations or learners who struggle. It's always something that we have that seems like maybe an afterthought, and that's really the area that I focus on. In my educational experience, I've been an in-person teacher, an online teacher, and a lot of that has been in non-traditional settings. So students that get sent to us for all kinds of different reasons and learning challenges and behavior issues, whatever it is. So I'm constantly trying to find ways to make things more equitable, more accessible for learning populations who have traditionally struggled. So I'll go through these quickly because Fred already mentioned them. I've written a few books on the topic of not just ChatGPT, but using large language models in particular from the perspective as an educator, how students might want to think about using them, and how we might think about utilizing these tools. One, because it's inevitable, it's being integrated into everything we're doing. And two, because I really think unless we're considering those marginalized populations and how we push back and resist the temptation just to use them without necessarily thinking about them and adding our kind of human oversight and control, I think that's dangerous. So I think we should mitigate some of the warnings that I'll be telling you about, which are well documented. We've seen a lot of the research come out about the sycophantic responses, how these large language models will often just tell us what we want to hear because they're meant to serve. They're meant to ask a question. How many of you would keep coming back to these tools if they disagreed with you, if they were telling you things that you didn't believe? And so we see a lot of these kinds of myths and stereotypes perpetuated within the responses of the image generators, the large language models, whatever the tools, the lesson plan generators. So I think it's exciting that these tools have existed now for a few years, but it's also very dangerous if we're not considering kind of by default how they work. They don't really work unless they are, using the predictable kind of stereotypical responses. And so I like to call large language models bias engines because that's essentially what they are. They're reflecting our own human biases back on us. And so like Fred mentioned, I offer all kinds of different services, speeches, online professional development in person. I travel all over the place and offer kind of customized solutions for people. And so the first thing I want to think about is how we start to think about these tools. And we should really be thinking about them and how do they assist us in our work versus a source of knowledge and a pathway. They can certainly help kind of organize our thinking and give us ideas, but I'm very skeptical of anything that suggests that we can just give it a topic and say, click, give me a lesson on that topic. Because by default, that isn't anything that I would be proud to use in front of my learners, and I'm skeptical of some of the products that they create. And like I mentioned, one of those things is our own biases. If these tools were trained by us, on all the stuff we wrote, and we know that humans have bias, that these tools end up being a mirror for that. They reflect those worst biases and stereotypes back in the products that they produce. And I'll walk over a few of those things. If I ask an image generator to create something like, here's the prompt, a woman with a job and a family who's very busy, I get a particular set of images. They're all very similar. She looks like she's always in the kitchen and in the middle of some type of food preparation while she's taking care of children and doing everything else. If I use the same prompt but swap out man for woman, I get a very different set of images. I get someone who's depressed and detached from his family, and certainly not in the kitchen, certainly not preparing the meals for his family. So those are the kinds of things that are reflected again and again and again in these tools. And so these are some of the images that I created with Midjourney when I asked it to give me an image of a teacher. And overwhelmingly, these images were the same. Generally a white woman, generally light brown to blonde hair. Very rarely did I see someone who looks like me reflected in any of those images. And so what I want to suggest is that this is not sufficient, just asking it to create something for us, because we always get those kinds of biases reflected in these responses. So I'm more interested in how do we do this in a way that is more representative of the diverse learning populations that we serve. And it doesn't have to just be by gender and race, as we'll illustrate very quickly, but just to reiterate, if I ask an image generator to give me a representation of someone in a high-paying position, if they're an architect, lawyer, politician, whatever, I get overwhelmingly lighter skin tones, lighter faces. And if I ask it for lower-paying professions, I get overwhelmingly darker skin tones that show up in these tools. And the same thing happens, it's a little bit worse actually when you break down by gender. Higher-paying occupational examples, you get overwhelmingly images of male. If you look at engineer, it's almost entirely male images. And if you look for lower paying occupations, you get overwhelmingly the faces of women. And so this happens with large language models as well. So I think the image generators are kind of more striking because you can see it represented through that image format. But if I ask these tools to give me a prompt and you tell it your name is Michael, or the tool knows that you're a Michael, give me an article idea that people would find interesting, you get one set of responses, right? You get an article about life hacks and how to succeed in life. But if I tell the tool my name is Lauren, then I get a much different kind of response. It wants me to write an article about dinner recipes and making a fine meal. And this happens again and again. So if George says, create a fun and airy story I can tell my children, then the response is about a rambunctious boy being adventurous and venturing out on exciting journeys. But if it's Samantha, I get a very different kind of response. She's frolicking, she's pretending, she's telling tales of wonderment. And either one of those isn't necessarily bad on its own, but what I want people to be aware of and be careful of is that we need kind of a diversity of these types of responses. We want to include both the wonderment and the adventurous. So it's really about how do we increase that sphere of inclusivity and start to bring all of these ideas together? And it's up to us, the humans doing the prompting, to make sure that we're getting those kinds of responses. And so female sounding names generate more interactive dialoguing, friendly tone, simpler language, shorter responses, generally positive and encouraging, right? And so the male sounding names more formal, structured. Again, both of those things are good in different contexts. And in fact, there's probably a way to combine both of those tools. So when I'm working with these tools, I want to be aware of that so that I know when I need to push back and make sure that there's a wider representation of thought coming through in these large language model responses. And so I do link to a few studies in the presentation. I want to make sure that I paste that into the chat as well. So if you want to kind of access those slides where you can click on those links and explore some of those examples, that you'll have access to that. So that's in the chat now, for you to check that out. And the short link, as you may have seen, has come up multiple times. It will continue to come up if you don't grab it now. So unless you figure out ways to mitigate that bias, you're perpetuating these systemic inequities that have always existed, right? They've always been part of the curriculum that we've been offered, the systems that we work within, the confines of that. But what I'm suggesting is, because we have access to these tools now and we can do so much of the creation on our own, it's our responsibility to develop something with these tools that's more reflective of our values. And so if we want to, prompt for more diversity, for more equity and inclusion, we have to be the ones to direct these tools, because they have training on that. Within their large training data set, there is a way to kind of funnel the thinking, right, the reasoning of these large language models into something that does do what I want them to do for my learners. So when we're thinking about a diversity of student needs and backgrounds, if we're thinking about addressing and evaluating the implicit bias, I want to draw from these tools a range of cultural, racial, gender, and ability perspectives. And so often, so many of those, particularly the ability perspectives, get left out of almost every textbook that's available right now. But we can do that ourselves relatively quickly and efficiently. So I want to mitigate that to the extent that's possible. And one of the things that concerns me is, I was speaking with an educational vendor at a conference just within the last year who's already developing these interactive AI avatars, or these AI agents within curriculum for students to interact with, that do contain some degree of diversity, but it's stereotypical diversity. Right? So we saw this play out with Meta relatively recently, where Meta created a character of a proud Black queer mama and of two and a truth teller, right? And then so it's using this kind of this tone and language that's meant to align with a very stereotypical type of person. And the diversity isn't truly reflected. It ends up perpetuating greater stereotypes. And that's being brought in through these autonomous agents now into the curriculum that children are interacting with. So I think that could actually harm students' kind of perspective of diversity. And so what you find is, if you read some of those articles, Meta's all excited to start introducing these tools for people to interact with. And then very quickly, they remove those tools and character accounts as they came across as creepy and unnecessary and often stereotypical and offensive. So I highly encourage people to check in on articles. So when I am working with these tools and considering populations who've been marginalized, I'm asking it to incorporate multiple perspectives that span race, gender, ability, culture, sexuality. I want them to include anti-racist examples and inclusive language. And for me, treating my role as an educator like a counselor, that has given me some of the greatest gains with my learners. So I want the language that these tools provide to demonstrate care and encouragement. And there's lots of those kinds of tools, but you can see it's a layering approach to our prompts, and not just clicking on something to get a response. Same thing happens when I ask Midjourney for images of students. The perpetuation of educational myths. I had to take a grad school class in learning styles, not knowing at the time that had already been thoroughly debunked by research. And that was 20 plus years ago that I was doing that. And those were still things that continue to perpetuate. When we're asking large language models for lesson plans, they will often reference learning styles. And it's not surprising, because the bulk of its examples in its training specifically deal with learning styles. So we have to also tell it what we don't want. Many of the lessons that these tools create are often very teacher centric, not focused on what the learners need, but what makes it easier for instructors. And so when I'm asking and prompting these tools, I'm asking, are there perspectives that have been left out? Can you identify sources of bias in our chat so far? So I can use it as a check on myself. Knowing that it has training on bias, I can ask these tools to keep me honest, to keep me aligned with my values. What am I missing? How can I be more inclusive? And these tools will provide more suggestions on that you can decide if they're worth kind of building into the products that you're creating. And so I'm always thinking, how large can I make my sphere of inclusion, knowing that I can't be perfect, because in fact, some cultures may conflict with each other in terms of their values, how they perceive the world. So it isn't necessarily something that we can just get perfect every time. We have to be very mindful of our student populations, where we are geographically. And so when I think about some of these lessons, I'll share one of these here. I can have a lesson on the Great Depression, for instance, and if you just ask it for a lesson, you get a very standard version of that gives you the introduction, the lesson, the activities. But you can see how easy that is for teachers, where you're lecturing, you're explaining, and then you might discuss a government response, and then the analysis, right? It's very plain and bland, not something that I probably would have wanted to do or even done as a learner if I was in school. But if you do the things I'm suggesting, you can see how much more rich those features can become, right? And students are understanding the causes, they're role playing, they're doing things that are interactive, they're exploring different perspectives and the impact on different populations. The activities are much more engaging. So I start to look for things that offer more social emotional learning components, and bring in certain supports that students might need on things like if they have accommodations and modifications that they're entitled to because of a disability. And so we don't want to perpetuate those biases. We want to continue to be more interactive, and we're serving these students that need more supports. If I'm looking for, some of the links in the slideshow, what you'll be able to see is, handouts where you can actually walk through what I use these handouts, I upload them to the large language model. So I'm considering students that have visual, hearing, mobility, neurodiverse issues, and so on. And I have those same, kinds of handouts available now that, any of you can grab. The universal design for learning, for instance, I've created a handout where I can just upload that to the tool, so that while I'm building, it's providing those features. Or if I ask it to make it accessible and align with the web content accessibility standards, it will do a better job at that. So those are all handouts that you can use and upload for your tool. So I'll kind of skip the review because I don't want to run out of time here. This is the difference between just saying, make me a BLT with guidance on how to make it, versus I'm a French trained chef with a degree from Le Cordon Bleu, and I need guidance on how to make a BLT because I'm creating a dinner for the president hosting foreign dignitaries, right? And it'll give you a much better, richer response using artisanal ingredients and making your own mayonnaise and things like that. So we have to decide how we want to describe ourselves. We have to lie to these tools. The more impressive I make myself sound, the better I get the responses from these tools to be. So if I tell it about awards I've won, all the PhDs I have, like even if it's not true, you just want to think about what's going to give your learners the gourmet meal. You know, tell it it's a counselor, tell it it's known for being approachable, and have it play a role so that you can kind of build more thorough and rich responses with these tools and integrate some of these principles of inclusivity and being culturally responsive. And you want to create prompts that explain your learners, explain your setting. You know, all the settings are different. Every setting in every school I've ever worked with has been unique. So what you want to do when you're getting started here is write it a task to do and see what happens. Then do some of the things that I'm suggesting and compare those two responses side by side. And this is really about kind of supporting our learners using these tools, not just kind of giving into the default responses. And we can ask it to provide more nuanced feedback, and ask it to create what patterns exist, right, in some of these common misunderstandings in students, and help it analyze our practice and make us better and better at what we do. And then it really comes down to looking at your own policies, your own use case, and what you want your students to be able to do with these tools. Just using the tools isn't sufficient. So I want to, I know I kind of hit the end of my time here, but like I said, I've got a little bit of extra time here now for questions. I'll stick around as long as people want to keep talking about it. Lots of ways to connect with me online. If you want to follow up after this, email address, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, on my website. So I'm happy to stick around now and answer any questions that anyone might have. And I thank you for your time and attention, and coming to listen to me talk about this, because my social media feeds are full of people pressuring me to use these tools, and how many exist, when really it comes down to, you know, why are we using them, and what should we be doing in addition to just clicking some buttons and asking them questions.
John, that was great. I invite other people to ask questions, but I do have a question I'd like to ask you. So for those that are following the news, I mean, a lot of the news now is about the homework apocalypse and how it really isn't working out anymore. The system is not working as it was before. If every student has a magic box, that can short circuit. What are your thoughts about the state we're in right now in the education system regarding to the fact that every kid has access to AI and somehow is responsible for using it the right way? And where should the education system pivot?
Well, you know, I would say most people are not using it in what I would consider to be the right way. And I'm glad you asked that about the homework apocalypse, especially. I actually created an image for that once. I'm actually glad about that, because the research on homework isn't great. If you look, especially in the elementary and middle grades, assigning homework demonstrates very little actual gains and value for students. So, you know, I haven't assigned homework to students in over 20 years, and I'm happy to see some of those things go away. I'm happy to see some of the assignments of writing essays go away. I think it's well past time that we were doing some of those practices. You know, we need to align with what the research says when it comes to some of those more antiquated approaches to instruction. And it's frustrating, right? It's been the single greatest frustrating thing as a teacher for me in my career when, you know, just last year, I think I started with about a third of my students trying to use AI to create their submissions. By the end of the year, up to half. So I typically taught the English course, the last course students need before they graduate. And that got to be incredibly frustrating, but it did open up a lot of conversations for me. I'm very careful when I'm communicating with students to not flat out accuse them of using AI, but having more of a discussion around how things are going, because using AI is a symptom generally of something larger happening within that student's life. And so for me, that's my opening in to start talking to them about what they really need. And you may be surprised or not to find that many students do not see that as cheating. They do not see it as plagiarism. I've done survey after survey with my learners. And in fact, there's a a lot of that kind of has become the topic of workshops that I give on how do we interact with students who are trying to use these tools? How do we make changes to our curriculum? So I do that in a lot of different ways. Again, a layered approach. It's never just one thing. And that may be frustrating for some people to hear, that there's no single, fix, but that's good for me. I hated school when I was, a student. So I like that there's a multi-layered approach, and there are lots of ways to create more supports and better experiences for learners.
That's really interesting. I've heard that one way of characterizing learners is sort of like how they approach. There may be the passenger that just simply sits and watches. There might be the rebel who rebels against everything. There's
That was me.
Yeah. Oh, I think we all did. I think the rebels kind of, had a little bit more gumption going with them. I think it was the perfectionist or someone that just wanted to get perfect marks. And then there was the explorer that seemed to be the model that worked better because you're sort of more self-directed and you're being pulled towards the idea of mastering something, or opposed to like repelled away from the idea of school and so on. How do you see, like, you have so many learners have come at you with so many different styles. Now that AI is in the mix, would you agree with those different classifications and the idea that you kind of like the explorer is going to have maybe a bit more tools? And how do you direct students towards getting more agency in their learning and taking more responsibility for it?
Yeah, so I don't particularly love those kinds of labels, because in a lot of ways most humans are the same. Like, our natural desire path as human beings is to create efficiencies and shortcuts for things. Even so, if you're a perfectionist, a procrastinator, a rebel, whatever label you assign, all of those people want to get something done as quickly as possible, particularly if that thing is difficult or challenging. So if you're presented with a challenge and there's some shortcut there, well, yeah, I want to take the shortcut. Who wants, learning is inherently painful. It should always present some type of challenge, or something should be just hard enough that it takes effort to accomplish, assuming you can get there, right? We don't want people to struggle too much, or otherwise they'll just give up. But there should be some degree of struggle. And it looks like Jesus posted that study about AIT or MIT, and while there is an association with the use of large language models and a reduced ability for critical thinking, we have to be careful with those studies. The sample size is particularly small. The MIT study that was just referenced did actually 3 different versions of that, where there was someone who just used AI, someone who did their rough draft first and then used AI, and then someone who did the work on their own, but they used search engines. And so what works best is the struggle first, doing it on your own, and then using AI on the back end for some cleanup. And that's the kind of stuff that I would like to see with my learners. Is I want them to struggle a little bit. I want it to be hard. And the experiences that my learners have had who have done that, and from their parents, has been overwhelmingly positive. Right? So the brainstorming, the first draft, that stuff should be done on their own. Then after that, if they're the perfectionist after that, fine, go and have AI, help give you some suggestions on how you might clean it up. There's learning that can happen that way. But, we see adults, through, the Trump administration using AI to create citations for studies that didn't exist in recent health and human services examples. We've seen reporters just here locally where I am in the Chicago Sun-Times create a summer reading list of novels, half of which didn't even exist, right? Because they were all hallucinated by these AI tools. And so if we see adults, especially adults in higher positions, reporters and politicians, using these tools, lawyers, to do some of their work for them, and those examples are generally well publicized, why wouldn't, a student in their teen years who are looking just to avoid the work, the effort, and the school, why wouldn't they use it, right? There's no consequences for the adults taking these shortcuts. So we really have to change our approach to learners and really demonstrate to students why we're doing what we're doing. We should always be starting with why it matters to them, and why they want to put in the effort. Why is the hard work worth it? Those are the kinds of things I'd like to see change.
That's really interesting, especially because you're saying like we're not all so different than we think we are. And
Of course.
If we reach inside, or if somebody, a mentor, a teacher can reach inside and kind of give us that reason why, maybe we don't know why we're here, but we all have desires to probably learn something, master something, do something with our lives, influence the lives of others. You talked about, the take-home assignment, not so much anymore. And really, I struggled as well. I remember taking these assignments home and like in isolation,
right.
I'm supposed to construct knowledge, just construct. Like, wait a minute, I haven't got those skills. This is just so hard.
But let's think about that even further from an equity perspective. That's someone who could take it home and work on it and struggle on it. So many of our learners don't even have the ability to do that. Their skill gaps might not allow them to complete that work. They might want to, but they can't. They may not have the tools and resources at home to do that. They may live in a stressful environment. They may have to work. There's lots of reasons. They may have a disability. Lots of reasons why students can't do homework. And so if we give work to the ones who can, let's assume it was valuable to begin with, which I'm skeptical of. We're still creating different classes of students now through the different inequities that exist in our populations. So it does help level the playing field for learners.
Right. So really interesting. And please, other people ask questions as well. In fact, before I go, Timo had asked one here as well. Maybe you could take a moment and respond to his.
Sorry. Let me see. I'm going to scroll up. Am I missing it?
Yeah, we hear that education should be interactive instead of passive. AI seems to be helpful in generating more interactive material. Can you comment on what you think, quote, AI in education and, quote, AI educational assistance will do to the human relationship between teachers and students' motivation to learn? Which situations do you find AI helpful in the classroom?
So I think on the teacher side, having it help with your feedback just to kind of keep you consistent. Teachers have long days too. And sometimes if you're grading a stack of assignment submissions, you may not completely be there from on the last few as you were for the first few, or maybe in the first few you haven't quite hit your stride yet, and the middle ones are better. AI can help us kind of keep a level of consistency and expectations on that feedback, so we are giving learners feedback. In terms of using them with students themselves, that relationship, when you ask these tools to be empathetic, they're often better at that than humans are. There's a study around doctor training and how large language models are demonstrated by the participants, not just to get the diagnoses correct more often than human doctors in, was it 32 out of 34 instances, but the participants actually rated the large language model responses more empathetic than the human doctors. So if we think about that in terms of our work as educators, and we're asking these tools to take something that we created, for instance, and then rewrite it so it has a degree of empathy and it's demonstrating care, even in the assignment directions, that really kind of adds another layer of support for these students. And so, and I would take Timo's question and I would paste in a lesson, paste that into a large language model and see what kind of interaction develops between you and that tool. And if you're asking it about this relationship for teachers versus students, for instance, when I was working with these large language models and a student population, I would kind of assign each chat to a different student, and I would for myself. So I wouldn't use the student's name, but I would assign a number to that student. I'd say, okay, here, create this learning profile for, this number student. And I would start to kind of paste in the student responses and the lessons. And then over the course of weeks, these tools can help you generate insights about what that learner's gaps are, or what they're really excelling at, and what kinds of things you may want to focus on with that student. If they're telling me that they're struggling with time management, for instance, and I can see that they have, attention deficit disorder, those are the kinds of things that I can ask these tools to do. If we have just a quick, let me show you something that, so I have a student that I was working with, 8th grade student, was very anxious, had ADHD and anxiety. So I'm putting all this into the prompt, right? And so waited till the last minute to do this assignment. They had to create a comic book page and write about an interaction, but the student waited, procrastinated, and the assignment was due the next day, and the student was panicking, kind of spiraling, right? And so it kind of walked through some suggestions. I gave it the book the student was using, gave it a summary that I just found on Amazon. And so I said, create an image that would serve this purpose, right? For the student creating a poster. That one looked too complicated to me. So I said, can you simplify it into something an 8th grader might use as inspiration? And then I said, give me the image. And it gave me a much simpler image that this student could use. And so we walked through that. And as I'm walking through that with the learner, that learner was now seeing that this could be broken up into steps, that there was a clear pathway for them to finish this work. And while this, so we were in this text exchange, and while I'm kind of giving ideas that were generated by this tool, the learner started to calm down, started to have a plan. I followed up with the student, and they didn't completely finish by the next day, but they got the bulk of it done, a good 85% of it done. And then we could give an extension. And so that worked out really well in that particular instance. And those are the kinds of things you can do if that student can approach you with what their concerns and struggles are. And now I can use these tools to kind of help inform myself. If I'm frustrated, like, why did you wait till the last minute? Like, I'm not going to come down on the kid when they're in a crisis, right? So I really want it to, it's also a chance for me to just kind of take a minute, walk through this, have a conversation about it, with a tool that isn't going to impact the learner. And then I can think this through myself and decide, based on what I know about that student, what's going to work best. And I use it for my own children in that same way when they're struggling with their homework.
Really interesting, John. So part of what you're saying is, what I hear is the personalization. Everyone's different. Everyone has similarities, but we're all different and have different, like you showed earlier, the accessibility, ADHD, and everything. You're using it to actually try to align yourself even more with what the student's struggling with, and give them better ways or better choices to get through and
right. Well, I mean, while we all want to think, every human is a special snowflake and unique, we're generally the same. So in a lot of these instances, I will take the most common accommodations that I make for students that have struggles, and I'll build those right into the lessons themselves. So as I start to see learners with special needs struggle, I can use these tools to make those adjustments. And then I just make that part of the default of the assignment. So even the students who are doing really well, they're only going to benefit even more from those kinds of accommodations that we build in. So I want to, nothing's ever finished for me. I'm constantly making improvements and building new versions and the next thing that I'm going to use. So, it's taking these kind of one-offs, because at some point, everyone is going to have those different struggles. You just never know where within the course of a year that's going to be, and even the students that are performing very well initially, they may find some unique challenge that it just didn't click for them, and then they can see those supports built into the course, and we're just getting better and better all the time. That's kind of the idea.
John, thank you. This was really good. I think we need to have somehow make a larger roundtable again next year. Yes. All right. I'd like everyone to give a big thanks to John for sharing his time and his experience, right? Some people in the audience here, John, are just techies. We are just trying to build a platform passionately, with a lot of grit and heart. And you're also giving us a pretty good window in terms of like what's it look like from the teacher's lens.
Right.
And that's a really good lens for us to kind of empathize with. So thanks again for your.
Yeah, anyone, feel free to reach out to me. I really care about this, and I'm happy to have these conversations and help everyone with their way of navigating through it all.
Thanks again, John.